Okay, great. All right. Thank you very much for being here again. Oh, Sheila's gone to turn off her rice. Well, that's good. Okay.
And maybe, I don't know if you want people to mute themselves or not, or, I mean, people could comment, but.
Yeah, people can comment if they want, as long as they don't have dogs in the background or whatever.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think that it's best if everybody mutes themselves. And if you have a comment or you want to clap or ha ha after a story, just unmute yourself for a minute. Okay, I'm going to mute myself.
Okie dokie. I'm going to start. Oh, I'll tell you who I'm doing today is Morrill Wills, Gladys Joyce, Alaskan Visitors, Roy Cum, Ellen Sonickson.
Station identification.
So funny. Deirdre?
Yes.
Can you send my sister Wendy Watts Pearson a link?
Do I have her email?
It's Wendy. Yeah, I think so. She's been coming on. Wendy Watts Pearson.
Okay. Okay, Pearson. Okay, I'll look her up.
P-I-R-S-O-N. Thank you.
Okay.
Okie doke. Anyway, and Roy Cum, Ellen Sonickson, and I'm going to talk. I also have an article about some Alaskan visitors, and also I'm going to read about the first television in Methow. Okay. So Hazel and Morrill Wills, 70 years together and counting. From the Methow Valley News, April 26th, 1984. The young and striking girl who stole Morrill's heart smiles when she says she's 88. She smooths his white forelocks back as he sits there thinking of other things. Next week, they will have been married for 70 years. Hazel and Morrill's memories mesh nicely once in a while, but when they don't, they allow each other the freedom of their own vision of their past. Morrill: how did I meet Hazel? He laughs deeply. Well, sir, I'll tell you. It was 1911. I was sitting on the hotel porch, you know, the one down at the end of the street in Twisp that burned in the Great Fire. Hazel: you were standing around gawking in front of McFadden's candy store. Morrill: I was sitting on the porch and here she comes into town in a wagon, and she had a great big white ribbon on the back of her hair. Hazel: I know I had on a straw hat. Morrill: and I said to George, there's the girl for me. Hazel: and I didn't even know it. I was so tired by the time I got here all the way from Pateros. Morrill: 2 months later, I made a date with her to go to a neighbor's potluck dance. Hazel: oh, Dad, it was later than that. Morrill: maybe it was. Hazel had reason to be tired the day she rode into Twisp on that trap. She and her family had taken the train from Snohomish to Wenatchee, the riverboat from Wenatchee to Pateros, where they spent the night in a hotel full of bedbugs, and then by wagon up the Methow. The family, the Folans, had bought a place on Bear Creek. Now, Morrill landed in the Methow on August 22nd, 1902, with a team of horses and one little race mare, after traveling from Kansas in a boxcar with his father, the stock, and their dog. His mother and brother and uncle traveled in the passenger train. They assembled their wagon in Spokane and set off to the west. They were leaving Kansas behind because the family's doctor, who had treated several of them for typhoid fever, told them to go to the tall pines. They clopped through Davenport and Cooley City, camping along the way, getting lost on the high plateau. There were no tall pines up there, so they kept going, swinging through Chelan Falls, and then up to Pateros, where they made camp down on the Columbia River. And that night, the wind blowed and blowed the tent down. They met Mason Thurlow as they turned up the Methow Valley, and he told them he had just the place they required. They camped a night at the Thurlow Ranch on Beaver Creek, where 11-year-old Morrill was tickled to death because we got all the watermelons and cantaloupes we wanted to eat. Goodness, who is that?
Oh,
Okay. Wendy, mute thyself.
I did. I've got it. Thanks.
Sorry. The place Thurlow had in mind was a piece of land behind Heckendorn, where the Winthrop Sewer Lagoon is today. The Thomas Wills family moved there without delay. Morrill recalls clearly the several grueling trips they took over Paradise Hill from Brewster, freighting their Kansas furniture to the newly constructed home. Morrill's father took over the Methow Trading Company for Guy Waring, Winthrop's Harvard-educated founder, and Morrill sometimes worked with his father there. Thomas Wills eventually left Waring's employ to start his own store in Charlie Graves's saloon. Morrill quit school after the 7th grade, since school seemed irrelevant when there was work to be done, and took up the carpentry trade with Carl Johnson as his partner. The two men constructed several houses in Winthrop and Twisp, including several in the old section of Twisp near the Catholic Church, referred to as Silk Stocking Row. For a time, Morrill drove the mail stage from Pateros to Winthrop and happened to have this comfortless job during the worst winter ever recorded in the Methow, 1915-1916, the year of the big snows. On the first leg of one particularly harrowing journey, he left Pateros with 4 head of horses, but it took him all day to reach the town of Methow. The next day, he made it almost to Twisp, but had to let the horses go, so he trudged the rest of the way through the deep snow with the mail bags slung over his shoulder. He borrowed a saddle horse to get the mail the rest of the way to Winthrop, but didn't make it any farther than the Red Bridge, which is just down here, before having to retrace his fast fading trail. I'm assuming the mail got to Winthrop, but that's where Morrill quit that story. After Morrill met Hazel, he started building a house for the two of them and finished it by the time they were married on May 3rd, 1914. You know, that day I played in the ball game, he said. He was a catcher for the town's baseball teams for years. Then I came back to the house where W.L. Singer married us. Their daughter Grace was born there. In 1918, they drifted out of the valley. In their 70 years together, they moved 40 times because his job as a carpenter building bridges around the state forced them to. Exhausting, Hazel pretended, panting. You said it. From then until 1955, he followed the work and built bridges from Ephrata to Fife to Ohop, taking jobs through the Depression as they came up. Sometimes it was difficult finding a place to rent, one that was both clean and affordable. In 1960, they moved to Bridgeport because it was central and near good fishing. They both love the Methow still and get a ride up with their nephew Wink Byram whenever they can. All their friends are invited to their 70th anniversary party next Sunday. And this is a story about Gladys Joyce, spelled Joice. She was recalling the Palace Hotel of 1926. From the Methow Valley News, August 23rd, 1984. I'll never forget how angry Bill Euler was at me the night the bank was robbed, reflected 80-year-old Gladys Joyce, shaking her head. Gladys was working at the old Winthrop Palace Hotel in 1926, living in a room at the back, right across from the bank. On that night, the owner's chow dog raised Merry Ned, but Gladys didn't get up to see why Beauty was doing all that barking. Meanwhile, a robber broke in and entered the bank next door and made off with a lot of money, according to Gladys. I don't know how much he took. I must say, I was kind of upset with myself for not being more alert. Gladys had not been back to the Methow Valley for 58 years until she returned with a friend last week. When they drove into Winthrop on Sunday for the first time since 1926, she said she didn't recognize the place. The hotel looks completely different, she said, but I knew where it should be because I remember the creek running behind it and that there was a bank next door, the famous bank of her memory, still there next door. Where Ira Smith's used to be a drugstore, and next to it was a big log restaurant. Nichols' store was down the street, which of course was dirt then, the street. The bank was a very rustic building of rough lumber, as were most of the buildings, but we were very fortunate to have a bank at all. Gladys was 21 that year and looking for a job. A friend introduced her to Palace Hotel owner Bill Euler, who took her on despite the fact that she'd never worked in a hotel before, but she needed the job to earn money to go to school. Schooling was a jagged operation, she said. I had to earn money between times. At the end of 7 months of work at the hotel, Gladys left feeling flush. She'd saved all $150 of her earnings. For $5 a week, Gladys put in 7 days and nights of waitressing, making apple pies, washing clothes, changing beds in the 10 rooms, cleaning the floors. Up at 5 a.m., she'd make a huge pot of coffee on the wood cook stove and then set the one long table for breakfast. All the meals were family style, she said. Everyone sat down together and ate ham and eggs and hot cakes, always hot cakes. No juice, but there was always pie too. It cost around 50, 75 cents. Rooms were $2 a night, if I remember correctly. Noontime, the main meal was served and ranchers would usually fill the 20-place table. During slack time in the afternoons, she'd play the hotel's piano or take a walk. Once in a while, she could take in a hoedown, at which she didn't do very well because I had 2 Methodist feet. 1926 was Prohibition time, but she never visited any of the stills, even though she said in the woods were full of them. Commenting on the Western theme of Winthrop today, Gladys said, you know, towns like this give people a chance to see how our culture used to be, maybe give them some understanding about the people and times we come from. But she added, they'll never understand the hard work that went into that life. Given her workload, it's not surprising that Gladys didn't leap from her deep sleep to strangle that yappy chow named Beauty while the robber robbed merrily away just outside her window. I wrote this for the Methow Valley News, March 22nd, 1984. Alaskan Visitors to TWISP are the last survivors of Race to Save Lives. TWISP received special visitors this week, 2 of the last 3 surviving dog team drivers who rushed diphtheria serum over the frozen Yukon River to Nome, Alaska in the bitter winter of 1925. Charlie Evans, 81, and Edgar Nollner, 79, took a rare, and for Edgar, a first, trip to the outside, that is, anywhere which is not Alaska, to visit their friends Pat and Laurie Patrick. Charlie's granddaughter is Laurie Flynn, who lives with the Patricks for over a year and attended Liberty Bell High School in 1982 to 1984. Edgar and Charlie are both soft-spoken denizens of the North who feel 1 week on the outside is enough. Stay too long, you might get civilized, they say. Charlie possesses an all-pervasive humor, and Edgar, who left his teeth at home so he wouldn't eat too much, can honk so effectively he can lure geese from the sky. In January of 1925, diphtheria broke out in Nome's population of 1,429 people. Because the disease spreads with devastating speed unless checked, serum had to be immediately shipped in. Alaskan flying was then in its infancy, and no one knew if planes could fly or pilots survive the incalculably low winter temperatures. The task devolved to the men with the dog teams. The message went out along the mail route that runners were needed at every stage, and at every stage, men answered the call. 19 dog teams carried 300,000 units of anti-diphtheria serum the 674 miles from Nenana to Nome in 5.5 days. Edgar Nollner was 21 that year. It was late at night and 41 degrees below zero when the runner from Ruby appeared around a bend in the trail. In a few minutes, Edgar and his 7 gray Malamutes, with his 8-year-old lead dog Dixie, set off for the 24 dark, cold miles from Whiskey Creek to Galena, keeping to the center of the frozen Yukon River. When he reached Galena, his brother George, newly married, ran the same dogs to the next transfer station at Bishop Mountain. Charlie Evans was waiting there and heard George singing an Athabascan Indian love song as the team pulled up to his door. Charlie, then 22, a half Indian, half white Yukon River pilot and school teacher, took the precious cargo from George's sled, and together they warmed it by the wood stove for an hour before he set off on his leg of the journey. It was now 61 below zero when he started on the cruel 30 miles to Nulato. He ran his team down the frozen river until he encountered open water where the Koyukuk River flows into the Yukon. It was hard going, skirting the dangerous open water, especially when a 2-foot deep layer of dense fog obliterated vision of the terrain. Only the tails and heads of the dogs rising out of that white blanket indicated that they were still on firm ice. The journey lasted 5 hours. I've hated February ever since, Charlie laughed. The only other survivor of the historic serum run, Bill McCarty, is blind and lives in a Fairbanks nursing home. Last year in Anchorage, an Eskimo came up to Charlie on the street and shook his hand for saving his life. He had been a baby in Nome at the time that Charlie and Edgar had helped speed the antitoxin over the frozen wastes to the town on the Bering Sea. It was good knowing I'd at least done that, said Charlie this week in TWISP. But he went on to reflect. I never thought the run was anything out of the ordinary. A book was written about the feat called The Race to Nome by Kenneth Ungerman, where the, pardon me, extraordinary story is chronicled. So here's a story about Roy Cohn. Written in the Methow Valley News, December 12th, 1985. You were working there then, Sheila? Roy Cohn, he's kept his eye on the weather. For 18,250 days, Roy Cohn has observed the weather in this valley for the US government. This month marks 50 years worth of snow and rain records, or 600 pages of daily computations that Roy has faithfully kept. And he does it for free. After 25 years, the Department of Commerce sent him a pin. After 40 years, he received a wooden plaque. In 1935, when Roy was 20, he took on his official task at the recommendation of homesteader Charlie Gunn, who had kept records for the Department of Agriculture since 1910. The Commerce Department took over processing national weather records in 1949. I just have been curious about snowfall, said Roy, who first kept records at his Mazama Ranch and for the last 10 years in Winthrop. I find it something interesting. Not everyone starts doing it young enough to keep records for 50 years, he observed. Besides accumulated rain or snow, Roy must observe such phenomena as fog, ice pellets, which is freezing rain, glaze, thunder, hail, or damaging winds that occur during each 24-hour period. He makes 3 copies, keeps one for himself, and sends the others to Seattle. From there, the data is sent to North Carolina, where pamphlets for each state are compiled. Now that Roy lives in town, he does not keep the official temperature, which is done at the fish hatchery, but for his own personal use. Roy has kept a diary since he was 14. In it, he writes down temperatures, when he starts to irrigate, when he turned the cattle out, and when he cut the hay. Most years you can figure it'll follow the same pattern. Also, I can solve anyone's weather arguments within about 10 minutes, he laughed. Once my diary was used in a court case to determine for sure when a particular herd was moved to pasture. 25 years ago, Jack Wilson asked to see Roy's records because Jack was thinking a ski resort might be a feasible enterprise in the early winters area. He wanted to discover how early snow fell in the fall, how long it stayed on the ground in the spring, whether the snow fell during the night or the day. And Wilson found out that snow fell mostly at night, a good sign since skiers, he'd observed, would rather ski in freshly fallen snow rather than in freshly falling snow. My records convinced him it would be a successful thing, Roy commented. Certain details from his cumulative years of keeping his eyes peeled on the valley weather stick with Roy, like the 27-hour period encompassing January 21st, 1935, when 52 inches of snow fell. Amazingly, the snow began when the temperature was 27 degrees below zero, although the bulk of it fell when it had warmed to a -5. The accumulated stuff was so deep, it filled your shirt pockets as you walked through it. But it was so light and fluffy, you'd just leave a little mark as it filled in behind you, he described. We used to get our snowfall during the new moon and our cold weather during the full moon. But in the last 20 years, we seem to be getting most of our snowfall during the full moon, he judged after half a century of observation. The early 30s, we didn't get much snow, but in the 40s and 50s, we had lots. In the last 10 years, snowfall seems to have tapered off. It snowed so much in 1956 and 1955 and 56, and in 61 and 62, you couldn't even see the fence posts. One of those years, we had 16 feet of cumulative snowfall. This extreme cold we've had this year is unusual, but the year we had 16 feet of snow, the same cold occurred in November. But don't ask me to predict the weather for this winter. I'll tell you next spring, he smiled, his blue eyes steady. This is about Ellen Sonickson. And also she's talking with Bill Lester, who lived in Winthrop. Ellen Sonickson lived in Twisp. And the scene, I wrote this for the Methow Valley News, November 10th, 1983. The scene, Winthrop Grange potluck, October 1983. A conversation begins between a man and a woman sitting opposite each other at a long table. He, where you come from originally? She, I grew up in Chelan. My family lived out on Antoine Creek. He, is that so? I ran the CCC side camp for 50 men up there in the 30s. Say, you remember the time that little kid got lost out there on Antoine Creek? She, I was that kid. He, my gosh almighty. After nearly 50 years, the kid, Ellen Sonickson, Twisp, and the boss of the CCC workers, Bill Lester, Winthrop, came face to face over macaroni in Winthrop. Ellen's revelation that she was that tiny, half-dead child lost in the bitterbrush on Antoine Creek startled the drama back onto the stage. Here's how it unfolded. On an evening back in the fall of 1936, Bill brought his Civilian Conservation Corps boys into Chelan for a show and a dance so the young men could let off steam. Meanwhile, the Chelan sheriff had gotten a message from the Tester couple up on the hill that their 2-year-old daughter had disappeared. Since the sheriff had only a few men at his disposal, he buttonholed Bill to ask if he could round up his men for a search. Bill rushed into the movie house, jumped up in front of the film, and announced the problem, urging all his men to come with him immediately. He did the same at the dance hall. They all come, every one of them, Bill said. They was the willingest kids. They all followed the sheriff into the Antoine Creek area, where they affixed headlamps onto their hard hats, and then they dutifully climbed down the bank and into the freezing creek. The parents thought she was drowned, said Bill, so my men waded that creek down. They kept falling in. They were sopping wet and cold, but there was nothing in the creek. So I lined them up against the hill, 50 of us, 10 feet apart, with those headlamps on. We marched clear out there a mile. They'd just about given up and turned around to head back, going a couple of 100 feet, when one of the boys cracked the night air with a yell, "Here's the kid!" We picked her up. She was one cold little thing. We hurried her back to her house, and the doctor, who had been called, gave her a hot bath, and she come out of it. It was well after midnight. If we hadn't found her, she certainly would have been dead by morning. Today, Bill shakes his head in wonder. I just couldn't believe the woman sitting across from me at the Grange the other night was that same little kid. the kid, as Ellen is now being called by her friends in the valley, has only hazy recollections of the incident, either from the intensity of what happened or from hearing stories about it all her life. She's not sure. Ellen was one of 12 children raised on that Antoine Creek Ranch, but in 1936, she was one of 5 brothers and sisters. She says she vaguely remembers getting into a fight in the barn with one of her siblings and then running out into the sagebrush, getting exhausted and sitting down and going to sleep. She laughs about it now. I've been told by several different people that they were the one who found me. I don't know who did, but it was the only time in my life I had so many guys looking for me. And there I was, too young to appreciate it. Okay. All right. I'll find it sooner or later. Here we go. One more, okay? Viewers turn on to new TV choices from the Methow Valley News, June 7th, 1984. We've come a long way in 30 years. But you know, since I wrote this article 36 years ago, it now adds up to 66 years. So I go on. Imagine it's the early 50s. Charlie Breslin is driving up dirt roads to all the hilltops he can find, waving an antenna around. His endeavor is to discover the whereabouts of an invisible signal that he knows is winging through the air. Being a patient and persistent man pays off. One day on Leecher Mountain, he set up his crude box, hoisted his antenna, and became the first human being in the Methow Valley to watch television. At that time, Spokane's KHQ broadcast shows for 2 or 3 hours a day. In the early days of TV, reflectors were illegal because the Federal Communications Commission said people were grabbing airwaves without paying for them. Warren Badger, he traveled down to Wenatchee to an FCC hearing to urge legalization of reflectors for the Methow. But the bigwigs didn't seem too sympathetic to the cause. One turned to Badger and spat, "You country hicks are a pain in the neck." Badger came back, "We're gonna be bigger pains in the neck by the time we're through." It took a spell, but the problem was solved. Valley people raised the money and Slug Davis set up the first reflector near Winthrop. Not long after, power poles were planted on top of 4,600-foot McClure, which to this day remains the main site for catching and beaming signals from Spokane to the 4 local stations. Okanogan County TV District number 2 technician Carl Anderson is the man who takes care of the local station sites. He snowshoes, hikes, snowmobiles, or drives to 9 pinnacles where repeater and translator equipment must be maintained. From McClure, the signal travels to Studhorse, Gold Creek, Lower Twisp, Methow, Goat Mountain, Carlton, Upper Twisp, or Grizzly, from which places the beam is sent into the different draws of this geographically contorted valley. Anderson explained that while transmitted television is the cheapest for valley users, it is often prey to different problems, like skip, which I'll explain in a second, and also outages caused by lightning or wind. Even the fire alarm in Twisp causes temporary outages. Also, horses and cows rub up against the antennae, jarring them out of alignment. Deer trip over the guy wires. Coyotes, for some reason, dig down under the snow and earth to get to live wires and bite through them. Dead wires, however, he says, hold no attraction for the coyotes. So what's skip? It happens annually between mid-May and the first part of July, and mostly in the evenings. A thermal layer forms in our atmosphere then to cause faulty reception of television signals. Anderson explained that Channel 2 from Kansas, which has a powerful signal, will bounce off this atmosphere layer and hit the main transmitters on top of McClure Mountain over Twisp, drowning out Spokane's Channel 2 signals. And there's nothing that can be done about skip. Viewers on this system pay $24 a year for the privilege of receiving these signals. Today, remember this is 1984, 18 satellites orbit the Earth, and if you are the proud owner of a satellite dish, you can kiss the flimsy little TV guide goodbye and spend a good portion of your waking hours reading the monthly 500-page magazine of satellite entertainment, and then get a royal headache trying to figure out which of the hundreds of stations you want to watch 24 hours a day if you so wish. In this magazine called Orbit, you can find where each of the satellites are around our planet and learn to decipher such sentences as the Fantasy Channel has begun scrambling from West Star 5 transponder 20 on Monday, blah, blah, blah. Independent dealer of satellite dishes, Larry Schauber, erected the first dish in the valley in September of 1981, and since then has installed 38 more. Here in the valley, the dishes pick up from 70 to 85 channels of video programming, 25 to 40 FM music stations, depending on the brand and system you have. Then there's the cable option. People in Twisp and Winthrop pay $38 a month to the Bellevue Company for 8 stations with 24 hours of news, sports, HBO, Cinemax, a Christian station, and a rock music station. Some people are content with just 4 stations, others with cable, and yet others say something like, next winter, either I get a dish or I'm going to Arizona.
Oh, that's great.
Is that
Remember
enough?
how
I think that's enough.
big those dishes were? They were huge.
Oh, they were huge dishes.
And what happened to them all? Where did they go? There must be a museum of them somewhere.
Boy, the landfills must be filled with them.
Now they're 3 inches.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And look how far we've come since then. And so remind me, what year was that when the first guy had the first TV in the valley?
In the early 50s.
Okay. That's not that long ago. I mean, I was born in the 50s.
Right.
It's a long time ago then.
Hey!
was
If I dyed my hair, I wouldn't look so old.
Yeah, me too.
Let's see.
Diana, would Ellen Sonickson, would that have been Roger's mother? Roger Sonickson?
Is Roger's
know?
mother Ellen Sonickson?
It's her, Roger's aunt.
Roger's aunt.